Thank you, Vasily. Thanks to the organizers. It's really an honor to be here and try to share some thoughts. Contrary to the previous speaker, Vasily, I'm Greek, so you have to help me with the time to be equally sharp. Okay, before I get to my slides, some general thoughts. And before we go to Greece, what has shaped modern businesses and what has shaped modern economies and what has shaped our way of understanding what economies are is a trend that started in the early 80s. The early 80s, as you all know, was just after the 70s, and the 70s was a time of oil shocks and war. Starting in the 80s, there was about 3 decades of increased global trade, integration of all sorts of economies. When I'm saying all sorts of economies, what we used to call the Western world, then China, then the collapse of all the Soviet bloc, and an increase in productivity driven primarily by the gradual integration of computers into production. It's really hard to even imagine how many things were happening in 1980 relative to how we do things today. All this gave support to increased incomes globally and in a sustainable manner for a really long time. And we took this for granted without questioning whether a lot of these forces could continue forever. The first signs of this fatigue actually happened in around early to mid-year 2000. And that's when we also started seeing an increase in global debt. Debt that was necessary to support standards of living, despite the fact that productivity was not increasing as much. Standing now in 2023, it's hard to predict how things are going to be 10 years from now. We have lots of questions. And these questions become really fundamental. If global trade is to actually retract, what does this mean for the division of labor globally? We had these reservoirs of free energy, of very cheap energy. For Europe, this was Russia. That's gone. We benefited from decades of free labor, very cheap labor, I should say, in Southeastern Asia and China. That it's either gone or will be gone 10 years from now. And if we're not going to have a lot of trade, but we are going to have more production closer to home, in fact, for Greece, people say this is a great opportunity, that European businesses and European economies would like not to import from half the way around the world, but instead look for greater assurance of supply closer to home. And that may mean Greece, the periphery of the Eurozone. But if that's true, and to a certain extent it is, it also means higher costs. If you talk to most people, the first thing they tell you is risk off. That's the world that we are entering. And if you are in a world where you have to face risks, this necessarily means that the costs are going to be higher. So looking in the next 10 years ahead, it's going to be, on average, higher energy costs, on average, higher capital costs, and supply chains are not going to run as smooth as they did in the past. Having said all that, and now let me get to some slides, the rumors for the death of globalization, as was also previously explained, are greatly exaggerated. So that's also what happened to global trade, according to one of the main indices. So lots of people were telling you, this is April of 2020, so just before, the This was the heat of COVID. And after that, we went not back, we didn't just go back, we went higher than back. Okay, so that's one. Now, of course, this hides a lot of changes in the composition. However, global trade is still there. The other thing that we saw is how this is reflected in capital markets, which have not suffered. The Americans had actually seem not to have cared much for COVID. They seem not to have cared much for their president, suggesting that global trade is not such a good thing. They didn't seem to care much about Brexit. Of course, the high energy prices following the Russian invasion into Ukraine was bad news for the markets, but even that seems like the global markets did not much care about. Although we didn't see not everyone saw this the same way. You see on the right the different implications for the European currency and the American currency, which has gone up. This is sentiment indicators on the left, which again, they show COVID, it happened, then we felt much, much better after COVID. In fact, there is a story that is hidden here, which is a very interesting story, which is that humans, especially Europeans, after they were locked in at home and they were told you cannot go out, post-COVID, we measure a higher propensity to consume at every level. People got a little bit more short-sighted. They said, I'm not willing to save that much in order to consume in 10 years, because who knows how things are going to be in 10 years. So people are consuming a lot more, especially services, not so much products. Then you can make a story about energy costs. None of the pictures I'm showing you are consistent, either with the collapse of global trade or with the collapse of the global economies. But in the background, you do measure increases in costs, including cost of money. That's the second big story here. That the central banks, Frankfurt, the Fed, London, have been pumping free, unlimited money into our economies was not something that just happened as a response to COVID. It started a lot before COVID. It started gradually, the famous QE, quantitative easing. What does quantitative easing mean? It means that if you have money, your money is not that valuable because the central bank prints money consistently. And they did this because they saw that the fundamental push in the global economies was not very strong enough. We wanted to support investment. We wanted more investment. And despite all the story about green transition and new energy sources, investment was lagging in Europe. So one thing that we did was we said, okay, what can you do? Money should be free. So we're giving people money to cover their consumption, to cover their investments. Excellent. And then inflation appeared. From 10 years of almost zero, it went to 10%. It started before the energy crisis. It started because we had a lot of money in our pocket. Everybody had tons of money. It was free, remember? But we couldn't go out for 2 years, so we saved this money and then we started consuming it. And then the Russians got into Ukraine, and this was a trigger for inflation to go from 3, 4, 5% to 10% in Europe, and now we are trying to get the genie back into the bottle. Okay. Here is a country some of us care about. It's called Greece. Greece is what the textbooks call a small open economy. The definition of a small open economy is one that cannot dictate the terms of trade. It's an economy that has to take the terms of trade as givens, and then to see where it can produce, how it should trade. So one thing that we see here is that Greece has been growing recently higher, systematically higher than the average European economy. So this is quarter by quarter. This is real GDP growth. So this is despite inflation. This is not inflation. So despite inflation, we have been growing faster than Europe. Now, part of this is a story about Europe, especially the Europe that depends on Germany. Germany is near zero now. Actually, the last quarter was minus. And then there are a lot of economies that are dependent on Germany. We are not as much. So why is Greece growing so much? It is growing so much because it went down so much during the debt crisis. It went down by 20%. There was no reason, actually, from an economist viewpoint, to go down more than half of that. So as we are catching up in terms of investment and in terms of unemployment reduction, Greece is growing. Then, of course, we recovered much faster after the pandemic because we had the tourism effect. And it's also a country that, you know, it's a long discussion, but the bottom line is that in terms of economic stability, we are doing quite well. I'm sorry, in terms of political stability. Okay, let's scratch a little bit behind the surface. Investment has been growing, but we need a lot more. Now, this is not one story, it's two stories. Corporate investment has actually held its ground quite well the last several years. It decreased, but not as much. It was investment in housing that collapsed. And it is recovering, but slowly. Now, why should I show this graph in a session that's about the global trends and how Greece connects to those? Because domestic savings is not enough to support the investment we need to grow. So we need foreign investment. We need foreign direct investment, but we also need all sorts of investment, portfolio investment. And it is a big question mark to what extent, how fast this can be done, bringing foreign money in. It was easier 2 years ago when this money had zero cost. It's not as easy now when the interest rates go up. The other story is about exports. All right, this is an interesting story which shows that actually even during the crisis years, this is exports of goods. This is not tourism or other services. Greek businesses have been making stuff and selling it to the global markets, a little bit more year after year. That's a very nice story. Greek businesses have been, in the last year that we have this data, exported about 40 billion euros worth of goods, when in 2004, a very good year for the Greek economy, we were only exporting 13 billion euros. So this is a trend that not many people notice, partly because this reflects exporting businesses and foreign markets. But those who are working in these businesses, they're actually making nice incomes. And actually, that's a nice story here. There is a measure that some economists will like to put forward, which is what we call extroversion. So extroversion is not the balance of trade. It's not exports minus imports. It's exports plus imports. So it's how much of this business you do with abroad, because also how it was explained in the previous presentation, imports are not necessarily a bad thing if they help your technology advancement. So Greece is gradually becoming more and more integrated into the European and the global economy. Good. Of course, we are having a trade deficit yet. Okay. Thank you. Money is becoming more expensive, though, as I said. So funding the transition to a new growth model is more challenging today than it would be a few years back. And we lost an opportunity to do this the easy way. And this is the famous current account deficit, which shows, which is a reflection of the competitiveness of the economy. This deficit, this is for over 8 months. So over the whole year, it's going to be about 10 billion euros deficit in the current account. And this is something that should worry us, as well as the fact that when it comes to goods, we do not have that many global brands, and we are more concentrated. That's a nice table that I don't have the time to explain. It's going to be a big mistake for the Greek economy if ahead of the turbulence we see in global markets, it actually retracts into its safety zone rather than open up. It has to open up again and shift capital and labor towards areas where it has a chance to be global champion. Thank you, Vasily.
Thank you, Nico. And in the playful exchange of negative and positive news, this is truly net positive, which is not to be taken for granted for Nikos Vettas' presentations. I think trade and technology have made the biggest difference and continue to do so. We will be running out of reserves of energy and low-cost labor in Southeast Asia, but overall global sentiment improves or stays positive. Cost is the big challenge, but extroversion is improving, especially for the Greek economy. So I think this is a net positive message for me.